Hiya, welcome. My name is Paula Rogers and I'm the CEO of Committee for Perth, and I'm delighted to welcome both members and guests to our very first New Horizons webinar for 2024. Before we begin, I would especially like to acknowledge that today, for those people who are here in Perth or Burloo, I would like to acknowledge the land that we meet on, the land of the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and pay respects to elders past and present. We're very privileged to live and work on this very special land, and it's something that guides a lot of the work that we do. For those not entirely familiar with Committee for Perth, because we have a number of, as I said, guests and non-members joining us today, I just really wanted to reiterate that the Committee for Perth is not just for the CBD. We advocate for the whole region of Perth. We're a member-based organisation and we've been going for 18 years. We currently have 131 member organisations across 42 different sectors, and that's our magic, the diversity of membership. We're independent and we're apolitical. And really importantly, and today's event is really talking about that future focus. We're advocating for the best possible future for Perth. And often you'll hear us talk about Perth 2050, but it really is that kind of out of political cycles, we exist to advocate for the best future of this place. Over the years, we have delivered 150 different pieces of research about the reputation of Perth, about transport, about infrastructure, and it really demonstrates, and the launch of the Perth Perception Survey today demonstrates our passion for evidence-based answers, questions, and supporting the foundations of the work that we do. In terms of the format today for the launch of the Perth Perception Survey, we'll have a 40-minute presentation and then there'll be an opportunity for you. And I have to say, it is so exciting to see all of you, the amount of people on screen. This is probably the largest group of people that we've had on an online call. So it demonstrates the interest that there is in this. Just also to let you know that we will be recording this presentation and we will send the recording and the slides after this for you. But I really hope that you use this session, you listen and you think of questions that you really want answered. So the thing I think is really exciting about the Perth Perception Survey, and this is something that Committee for Perth has done, the first one was done in 2012, and every 3 years, so this is the 5th wave of the survey, and it really is kind of testing what people think about living in Perth, whether they're happy to live here. We focus on intergenerational differences, what Perth has, what are the strengths that Perth has, and interestingly, over the years, that economic diversification theme keeps coming up time and time again. For example, the 2018 survey, people weren't really upbeat, and that kind of represented the economic climate of living and working in Perth. Lifestyle is always a plus, but we often have that culture gap coming up in surveys as well. And for example, in 2021, life in Perth was perceived at 78% as really offering a good work-life balance. You'll hear a lot today about the intergenerational differences and the views on density and vibrancy, which are really key elements to livability, which is something Committee for Perth really focuses on. In terms of how to ask questions, you'll see on the top of your screen there's a Q&A button. That's where you can put your questions in and we will share them with Sally. So I hope there are lots of questions, and I would now like to welcome Sally Braidwood, who is Head of Corporate Responsibility, Reputation and ESG Research at Ipsos, Australia and New Zealand. She's going to launch the 2024 Perth Perception Survey with you now. Welcome, Sally. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Paula, and hi, everyone. Very exciting to be going through a more detailed look at the Perth Perception Survey, the latest report. Anyone who was at the event a couple of weeks ago in that beautiful floor in QV1, you had a snapshot of the information, but today we've got more detail to share with you. Still not quite everything that is in the report. We haven't got that time to cover every single piece in the report, so do know there is more available within the full report. But we want to give you a really good run through of some of the really interesting pieces that have come out. To Paula's point, there's such a rich evidence base that sits behind the Perth Perception Survey, and indeed some of the other studies we've had the chance to partner with Committee for Perth on over the years. So just Paula gave us a great context there, so I won't spend too much time here. Where we can, we do look at data all the way back to 2012. I will say the study has changed a lot from 2012. I very fortunately joined the business in 2014, so I've had the pleasure to work on 4 waves of the study. But looking back at 2012, it was 5 or 6 minutes, really short and sharp, and probably aimed at getting some nice media cut through for Committee for Perth to generate some attention. Since then, it's really evolved into a very detailed and comprehensive study designed to equip the Committee for Perth, as Paula said, with that evidence base to help look at where there's opportunity for advocacy, with that common goal that I think most of us on this call have of making Perth the very best place to live, work, study, invest and visit. So lots of historical data we'll bring in. A few new things we did look at this wave, and the other piece we're looking at historically is the 2019 Perth Reputation Study. It's given us some other pieces of data to pull in. And just very quickly, for anyone with a research or statistical interest, we've got a really healthy sample that we do look at. So we speak to 600 people right across Greater Perth, so spanning from the north of the metro area right down to the Peel region. And we have quotas in place to ensure age, gender and location representativeness across the Perth metro area, so we can be really comfortable with our sample in terms of it being representative of Perth citizens. So 5 key things I do want to try and cover today in our time together while still leaving some good time for discussion. So we'll look at broadly, what does life in Perth look like today? What is it like to work here? What's it like to do business here in Perth? Very topical, what are our attitudes and perceptions when it comes to housing? And looking forward to 2050, how do we feel about growth and what Perth might look like in 2050? So let's start with our first one here. What is life like here in Perth today? A question that we did pull from the Perth Reputation Study, because it gave us some really interesting information when we included it there, is to start pretty early with a question around how would you describe Perth to someone who's never been here before? And in some ways, it's the ultimate sign of advocacy, isn't it? How do we speak about our city? What is the language that we use? And what you can see in the darker colour is results from this year, in the lighter colour, results from 2019. And we've just coded them, you know, green for positive mentions and the pink here for anything that was a little bit more negative. So what is interesting? What has happened in terms of how we describe ourselves? We've really leaned into these pieces around natural environment and lifestyle, which over time has been pretty constant, but we're seeing this strong growth up nearly 20 points across these 2 pieces. We're leaning into that, seeing ourselves beautiful natural environment and a really great place to live. Nice to see increase here in perceptions, and top of mind comments that there being a lot to do here in Perth. What a win. It's one of those challenges we've maybe had, and it could have been self-fulfilling prophecy when we talk about culture here in Perth, but fantastic to see that spontaneous increase in us saying about our city that there's a lot to do, there's great entertainment. What's come down in line with that? Less of us are describing Perth as boring or average. So nice growth in positive mentions and that decline in negative mentions. Still sticking there is this sense of being remote or isolated, but 7% of us only mentioned that. So still there, hasn't shifted, a minority view. Some really nice shifts in terms of how we're talking about our own city. I guess the key measure we use to look at how we are feeling at an overall level, we ask overall how satisfied Perth residents are with living here in Perth. And here you're looking at, this is a measure we've been tracking since 2012. So we can see overall satisfaction. So here in the dark green is those who are extremely satisfied. So 8, 9 or 10 out of 10 in terms of satisfaction with living here in Perth. And we can see broadly there's not a lot of dissatisfaction, but we have seen some movement over time. To Paula's Paula's point, 2018 was a challenging time when we did the survey. So we did see that decline in those feeling very satisfied with living here in Perth. We saw that shoot back up in 2021, not quite to 2015 levels. And in 2024, we've stayed stable with where we were in 2021. Slight softening, but not a statistical difference. So really, we're saying we're pretty similar to how we were feeling in 2021. And 2021 was interesting, wasn't it? Well, post-COVID, I think many of us, you were probably in one of two camps, really appreciating what we had here in WA at the time. Coming out of COVID, our experience was quite different and milder compared to a lot of other parts of the country and the world. But of course, our borders were shut. So that really impacted people's lives and business, depending on your orientation. So we thought potentially that was driving some of the overall positivity in 2021. And now we're sitting 3 years down the track. COVID is a lot, for most of us, a pretty distant memory. And we've maybe stabilised in our sense of how we're feeling about life here in Perth. But the overall takeout satisfaction is still pretty high. We also asked questions around why people live in Perth. There's not been a huge amount of movement across the 3 waves that we've been tracking these pieces. So different elements from lifestyle to family connections, climate, great for families and safe environment. And one thing that's maybe interesting is family connections decreasing as the key reason for living in Perth, which ultimately I think we can take some benefits out of. We can't control people's family connections, of course. So if that's less so the really dominant reason for people choosing to live here, we can maybe point to, so yes, lifestyle has stayed constant, just tipping out at the top, but it's more of a choice factor, isn't it? If people are here, not so because they have to for family connections, but it's lifestyle and these other pieces really driving decisions to live here. In terms of people's plans for the future, so the bulk of Perth residents do plan to stay long term, and this has been really consistent, so very much in line with what we saw in 2021. Again, consistent, 9% of us plan to leave for a time but return, and just 4% plan to leave Perth and not return. So all of these pieces are really quite consistent with 2021. Doesn't add to 100 because there's some people who are unsure of their plans. Who is leaving? Not unexpected. It's younger generations that are planning to leave Perth either for a short time or for permanent reasons and not return. And the drivers, again, are what we would expect and arguably very hard to counter. There will always be that desire amongst younger generations, particularly Gen Z, to explore the world. For Gen Z, it's travel followed by work, whereas for millennials, work followed by travel. And pretty consistent across time, these measures. And like we say, a lot of these are hard to counter. That desire to go and do things arguably will always be there. So quite consistent in terms of younger generations looking to leave and explore. Another question we've tracked for several waves now is how have we seen Perth change? And change is, of course, one of the most difficult things to manage, whether it's personally in business or certainly in terms of a city and placemaking. What we can see is there's always been some polarisation in terms of perception. So over the past 10 years, in the green, we can see those who feel Perth has changed for the better, and in the pink, people who feel Perth has changed for the worse. There's some in the middle who feel Perth hasn't changed. So we can see where we had a bit more optimism in 2021, we can see it coming back to more of the polarisation, almost exactly in line with 2018, where we're quite divided. Some of us can see great change over the last 10 years and others feeling a little bit more maybe nostalgic for the past. And we can certainly see some big differences across the generations. So that optimism in terms of seeing good change amongst the younger generations, and we see that crossover with our older generations, including Gen X or Millennial and Gen X, who are much more likely to feel that things have actually changed for the worse in Perth over the last 10 years. In terms of what those changes are, so what's gotten better in Perth? Transport and infrastructure, which is probably a great win. It's often been one of the challenging areas across Perth Perception Survey and identified as a key area for improvement. So great to see that 42% of those who feel Perth has changed for the better are spontaneously mentioning infrastructure and transport as things that they've seen improve. And we had some good discussion with Paula and the board a couple of weeks ago when we went through this. Potentially even the planning for improved infrastructure and transport can see perceptions improve. There's certainly a lot of and transport planning and projects underway, not yet fully opened. Certainly there have been some that have opened, but arguably just a lot of activity around transport, which is seeing people feeling there's some really good shift for the better. Another nice theme, a growing modern city, a sense that Perth is bigger, more progressive and globally connected. So a nice theme coming through for better change, improvement here in the last 10 years. Again, this theme, more to do, better attractions across hospitality, sport, retail and lifestyle, and also a sense of economic growth. So more and also better jobs and strong economy coming through as well. For those who feel there might have been some decline over the last 10 years, there's probably three dominant reasons that come out. Public safety coming out at number one. That is stronger amongst older generations. So that sense of personal safety coming through as a challenge. Cost of living, and linked to that very closely, of course, the housing crisis. So those pieces really being felt. And we've got some more data where we deep dive into housing a little bit later, and we can certainly see that coming through. And the other theme that comes through in terms of what's changed for the worse is too much immigration, which again, we can probably link to concerns around housing as well, and the competition for housing that we're certainly seeing. We had some other questions around, how we see ourselves, our sense of community, our values. So here we can see just some nice broad agreement. So 74% of us feel there is a good sense of community here in Perth. 1 in 2 of us think it's easy to integrate with Perth locals, and nearly 1 in 2 of us think there's really no barriers to upward mobility here in Perth. Just to counter that though, bringing in an element here, so how many of us feel there's an concern or there's an issue around race discrimination here in Perth? Nearly 1 in 2 think there is a concern, so not a majority. It's potentially sitting there as an issue that some feel and others don't. Again, it's interesting though if we look at that across the generations. And so it's our youngest residents here in Perth that are most likely to feel there is a challenge we have around racial discrimination here in Perth. We then have lots of measures that we measure across time, and these really cover off economy, services, housing, lifestyle, culture, very long list detailed that we've been able to track over time that gives us a great evidence base of how we're doing across these detailed areas across Perth. So the question is, to what extent do each of these things represent life in Perth today? So things that we're doing well, we really associate with life in Perth. Here we're looking at around half of the measures, so across economy, services and housing. And for most of these measures, we've got data from 2018. So how do we see ourselves? 47% of us feel there is a strong economy here in Perth, compared to this 73% of us who feel we have a mining and resources focused economy. Some lower levels here around entrepreneurial, innovative people, an affordable place to live, technologically advanced and being a leader in the energy transition. Up here, access to effective public transport, 47%. And where we're seeing these arrows, it means it's an improvement from where we were 3 years ago. Safe place to live, world-class public facilities, spread out, and the right mix of density. As I mentioned, we've been tracking these. So where we've seen some shifts across time and bringing in 2018 data. Strong economy, yes, where we are now has eased from 3 years ago, but look where we were in 2018, just 20% of us feeling we had a strong economy here in Perth. So arguably a lot of ground made up in terms of how we see our economy. Mining and resources focused economy, we really grew on that perception in 2021, and it's really stayed as of something that we see very much in terms of our economy. And some of those other pieces that we saw which are encouraging, and going back to that top of mind mention around effective public transport and infrastructure, we can see that nice increase in those who feel that we have access to effective public transport here in Perth. So some interesting shifts in terms of what's the same, what we're maybe really leaning into and doubling down on in how we see ourselves. Similar view here, so around lifestyle, just really aligning with what we saw top of mind. So very much, 2 in 3 of us feel outdoor orientated active lifestyle, natural beauty, attractive climate, really strong in how we see ourselves. Also good for families and accepting of people from different cultures. Less movement across time in terms of these measures, they're grouping together a little bit more, whereas those previous ones where we saw a bit more shift across time, and some really encouraging shifts as well in terms of how we see ourselves. We take all of those measures and we do run a statistical model to tell us, well, if we know roughly that how many of us are satisfied with life in Perth, and we've got all these detailed measures that tell us the extent to which we feel these pieces really reflect life in Perth, we can do some modelling to see, well, what is actually most influential in determining whether or not we're satisfied with living here in Perth. So of those 20 or so measures, these are the ones that are most influential in determining the extent to which we're satisfied with life in Perth. What is really strong is this piece around good for families. And again, if you think of those top of mind associations, natural beauty, outdoor lifestyle, attractive climate, lifestyle is really driving our satisfaction. And I would say maybe this is something over time we've tried to diversify or really think about. A lot of the discussions in previous waves of the study have been, oh, this isn't driven by sort of economy or job prospects or opportunity, but maybe there's something really unique and amazing here around how we are seeing ourselves and lifestyle being that determinant of satisfaction and a key reason that we're choosing to live here. Excuse me. So interesting there in terms of what is driving our overall satisfaction. The final piece that I'll look at in this section, a question we have asked for several years, is if you were Premier for a day, what would you do? What would you focus on? What would you change or bring in? Has always brought some very interesting responses, and this is completely open text so people can type anything they like. The dominant things that come through this wave is I would focus on housing, cost of living, urban policies, the justice system, and social issues. And this, I think there's a lot of alignment with some of those other pieces we were seeing, very much in terms of what those who felt Perth had changed for the worse, what they were focusing on, housing, cost of living. And then some of these, remember we saw that for those who felt Perth had changed for the worse, there was a focus on public safety in particular, and potentially leaning here at justice system and social issues, etc. So a lot of alignment this wave. Some interesting verbatim that come through. It does always make quite interesting reading to see what people would do if they were Premier for a day. But I think we can see some alignment on priorities in the eyes of Perth residents. Let's jump across and I'll try and move a little bit more quickly to make sure we cover everything off. What's it like to work in Perth? So just for some context, looking at the unemployment rate at the different periods when we've done previous waves of the survey, the context that I'm sure we're all acutely aware of is that unemployment is relatively low and certainly lower than the periods when we've done previous Perth perception studies. So that is the context we're speaking to people in, relatively low unemployment. And that is reflected in how we feel about our current job security and our prospects for jobs here in Perth. So overall, how satisfied are you with prospects here in Perth for job prospects in the short term and also the long term? We can see in 2021, despite a lot of concern around COVID and what that would mean for jobs, the economy, business, etc., we can see we did actually improve in our sense of satisfaction with our jobs here in Perth, and that's stabilised and that positivity has remained in 2024. Similar questions, but slightly different expression of how we're feeling. So I feel my job is secure, 7-point increase from 2021. And there's plenty of jobs available for people with my skills here in Perth, a 9-point increase from 2021. So arguably, and something we were very interested in post-COVID is, did it reshape how people thought about jobs, how we work? And so we can see definitely that increase in people's sense of what they can do here in Perth, the jobs they can have and the job security they do have. We were also interested this wave, so we don't have historical data here, to look at how people are currently working. So we can see the vast majority of Perth residents are working in an office on location. 24% are hybrid in their work arrangement, 10% are remote, and 3 fall into a different type of category. We were interested in this remote number. You might remember a lot of discussion around COVID as well. Would this shape how people work and where they work? And would it open up the opportunities for people to live in a place like Perth, which we know is dominated by those perceptions of great lifestyle? Could it maybe open up opportunities to work here, work remotely, and still tap into your organisation wherever that might be based if it's not here in Perth? As I said, we don't have historical data. We've now got this as our benchmark. We can look at it in 3 years' time and see, has this mix changed? Certainly there's some sounds from government of pushing people back into office even more strongly that might have already been happening, and across the private sector as well. But this is where we're sitting at the moment in terms of Perth residents, those who work, what their work arrangement is. And those who do work remotely, this 10%, quite interestingly, the vast majority of them are working for a location, an office based in Perth or a business based in Perth. Just 15% at a national level and 9% working for actually a global company. So their office is outside of Australia. Again, who knows what this might have looked like pre-COVID, but we've now got a benchmark going forward just to see how this might change and the implications for Perth. Potentially not new news, but just giving some numbers behind probably what we see in here anecdotally. So what are the benefits of remote or hybrid working? Work-life balance, flexibility, saving that commute time, the cost of commute as well. For some, though, better time zones if you're able to work flexibly and work remotely, and access to childcare as well. But the piece that's probably been getting a lot of attention, the social impact of actually working remotely. And so that is the key challenge that's identified from Perth residents if they are working remotely. Continuous education, we touched on this in the survey too, and again, anyone who might have been at previous report launches where we looked at the future of work a few years ago with a focus on the impact of AI. It was a key focus for the committee to understand the impacts for here in Perth, and that was a study that actually looked at WA audience rather than just Greater Perth. And we saw there some flags that potentially WA residents weren't prepared for the impacts of AI that may be coming, weren't necessarily feeling the need to retrain and focus on continuous education. So we continued along that theme, looking to understand attitudes towards continuous education. So broadly, we feel that education is valued by businesses in Perth. Broadly, we also feel that continuous education is really important to the future of Perth. But fewer of us feel continuous education is important to us personally, and that certainly declines with age. So just something in that, and it did come up at the event, I remember the launch for the Future of Work study was very much around for the education sector, and particularly really thinking about the future implications and how we do have people with the skills required for the future. There's a bit of a barrier at the individual level. So I can certainly agree that continuous education is important for the future, but I might not feel it's for me personally. So we dug into that a little bit as more as well. And we can see 42% are interested in further study, 34% are not, and very much individual reasons, but we can group some of them up. So what is driving people to consider further education for themselves? And there's kind of 3 focus areas. One is around that focus on personal development. So it might not necessarily be linked to a job reason, but a sense of wanting personally to continue learning and evolving and developing skills. The next dominant reason is certainly around career progression. And then for a few people, it's literally a case of moving to that next level of their tertiary education. The barriers, 55% of this 34% who are not interested feel it is not required in their role, their personal circumstances. So they feel really comfortable and established in their career and don't see a need for formal education. And that doesn't have to be, through a university system. It's any sense of additional education or study. Some dislike the formal education environment in a sense that it's not practical, it's not based on real world skills, it's too academic. And for others, it's certainly a priority issue, which is very hard to shift and change. But quite interesting based on where we were, we are now very much in the AI age. Most of us are using it every day in some way in our work, but interesting where people are sitting in terms of their individual propensity to consider further study. Final piece to look at in this chapter here is just some generational breakdowns around attitudes to entrepreneurialism and would we rather work for ourselves or somebody else. So the very first one here is that I'd rather work for someone else than work for myself. And we can see it's actually baby boomers who are most likely to agree that they'd very much rather be working for someone else than be running their own business. We then look at you make more money if you run your own business. This is where we get a huge disparity in perceptions amongst the older generation. So yes, I'd rather work for someone else than myself, and I'm the least likely to think there's actually financial benefit in working for yourself compared to working for someone else. But we're starting to see this pattern here with Gen Z, and we see it come through again. So the rewards of owning a business are higher than the risks. Gen Z most likely to feel that way. And also I'd be happy to take risks to enhance my economic standing. Now, again, we had some good discussion with Paula and the board when we did look at this a few weeks ago. Some called it optimism amongst Gen Z, others called it naivety. But however we unpack it and what we think might be driving it, there is some optimism there and this openness to entrepreneurialism, which arguably is great for any city. So there are opportunities to harness that optimism and that excitement, and certainly opportunities for Perth's growing startup scene if we've got a younger generation with an appetite to really be forging their own careers and driving it themselves. So flowing on from that, what is it like to do business here in Perth? So again, just bringing in some external data to set the context. So this is some ABS data on business startups. So we can see, compared to previous years, there is an increase in actual businesses starting here in Perth. Whether that is also an increase based per capita is an interesting piece that could be layered across, but on net numbers, there are more businesses starting here in Perth than there were in 2019 and 2020. And we can see in 2021, we saw this nice improvement in terms of recommending Perth as a place to start a business. This is one of our weaker areas of self-recommendation. We're much more likely to recommend Perth as a place to live and a place to raise a family. And that, again, linking to those lifestyle elements. We've always been a little bit weaker and also weaker than some other cities when it comes to our likelihood to recommend Perth as a place to start a business. We saw improvement in 2021 and it's stabilised. So we're still sitting at the same level in 2024. 59% of us think the business opportunities here in Perth are as good as anywhere else. Could that be higher? That does also mean 41% of us think it's not, that there is a gap between the business opportunities here and other locations. So maybe an area for continued opportunity for more growth in Perth. Here we have as well. So it's easy to start a new business here in Perth. Good trend of that increasing, those perceptions, but still only at 32%. And also there are sufficient incentives and protections to make starting a business worthwhile here in Perth. So again, sitting at that 1 in 3 level. What is encouraging is that we can look at the data and there's a way of identifying people in decision-making roles within their businesses. And we can see agreement on these measures is higher amongst that audience who is maybe a little bit more informed in actually trying to do these things. So some positive signs there around what is the environment and the landscape like here to actually start a business. But overall, potentially, as we said, still some room to improve. And then one of the more contentious areas, or is it contentious? So we have some tracking data that we're looking at here around attitudes towards deregulation of trading hours. So the first one here, Perth's retail trading regulation puts us at a disadvantage compared to other modern cities. 59% of us agree, and that's up 7 points from 2021, just compared to just 16% who disagree. So a strong majority see it as putting Perth behind our current retail trading hours. Deregulation will attract people to the CBD and other centres, strong agreement. And so it seems we're, very confident in the benefits that will come and sort of the negative impact that comes from our current trading hours. But similarly, we're really comfortable with the trade-off or the impact because nearly 1 in 2 of us also agree that if we deregulate trading hours, it's going to hurt small business. So it seems this is a tension we're willing to take. We can see whether it will or not actually negatively impact small business. I know there are a lot of studies that might counter the idea that it will, but at the moment as a public, we're willing to accept that as a trade-off. We can see the benefits that will come. We then went into some specifics to look at where support's at for actually specific levels of change. So 62% of us, up 7 points again, support trading on Saturdays, changing from 8 till 5 to 8 till 9. Sunday changing from 11 to 5 to 8 to 6, 67% of us support that again, up 7 points. And complete unregulation of deregulation of the trading hours environment. Nearly 1 in 2 of us supports complete deregulation of trading hours. So I would say, and this was one we didn't have tracking for, but arguably the sense of Perth residents is quite strong in terms of where support sits. Housing. What is happening with housing? Again, some external data to set the context, and I'm sure not news to any of us given the focus, but there is a reason we're feeling things pinching when it comes to the housing market. The median house price has certainly increased sharply over the last couple of years. And again, looking at the context of the last times we did the survey. So it makes a lot of sense that 76% of us feel that the housing market is unaffordable here in Perth. And really interesting is that it's baby boomers who are most likely to agree with this statement, and potentially a lot of empathy coming from that baby boomer cohort with children trying to enter the housing market and really feeling that stark difference compared to when they themselves might have entered the housing market. Of course, we also know the impacts, social impacts, particularly on women around housing stability if they find themselves with lower levels of super and potentially leaving marriages, etc. So there could actually be baby boomers themselves facing the challenge of entering the housing market. So broadly, though, very strong agreement that the housing market is currently unaffordable. Likelihood to recommend Perth as a place to buy a house, it's softened. So we're back at 2018 levels where we had come up in 2021. And so again, a flow on of that sense of affordability. And do we think it's a good time to be buying a home? Just 25% of us feel it is. Similarly, thinking it's a good time for first home buyers. We're much more likely to be thinking it's a great time to be selling if you're in that position. Pretty strong statement here. There's currently a housing crisis in the community where I live. 72% agree to some extent with that statement. 72% of us feeling there's a housing crisis in our community, and agree. And interesting here, we can see Gen Z feeling that most acutely. Still high across most of the generations though. So strong sense of, I guess, the acuteness of the issue around housing affordability. Reasons behind this, and this is a really interesting one, and anyone who has to deal with policy in this space or the business environment in this space knows the complexity and the interconnectedness of issues. So here we had really looking to understand what people saw as the drivers of the concerns and the impacts we're seeing in the housing market. Lack of supply, number one, high interest rates, trade shortage, increased overseas or interstate migration, too much regulation, and some NIMBYism coming through there as well. But really strong perception it's a supply challenge. And so whether that is actually trades to build the houses or overall lack of supply, a sense of that is what's driving the cost increase. And we're feeling quite critical of the government when it comes to what we're facing with the current housing market. So overall, the extent to which we feel the government's doing enough to address the housing issue here in Perth, pretty strong disagreement that they are. And we can see that is strongest amongst older generations of having that perception. And just really pointing to, I guess, how top of mind these concerns are. If we think back to that question we had around what would you do if you're Premier for a day, these are some of the top of mind comments that came through. So 11% of people spontaneously put something in there around improving housing affordability or rent controls, fixing the crisis and the lack of supply, building more housing, acting on homelessness, and restricting foreign ownership of housing as well. So just really reiterating how top of mind this concern is. Density. So some measures we have had across time. So the extent to which we think there should be more high density living here in Perth, it was 36% of us who felt this way, that there should be more high density living in 2021. For one of the first times that we've been tracking this data, we've seen a pretty big jump in agreement with that. So up to 48%, nearly 1 in 2 of us feeling there should be more high density living. 29% of us think we've currently got the right mix of density. So the minority, so most of us feeling we need to be doing something different when it comes to density. And also most of us feel that it's very important to the future of Perth, having that right mix of density. In terms of what's driving this increase in support for density, if we just look here in the blue, we can see it's Gen Z who are most likely to be supportive of higher density. And when we get down to some of the older generations, it drops to well below 1 in 2. So I think we'll take the gains where we can get them, because this has been a really stubborn measure across time. And, I think we can all speak to what we see in here anecdotally around concerns about density. So some optimism and opportunity with the younger generation to hopefully start shifting perceptions, but similarly still budging up there with millennials and Gen Z as well. We've got a challenging situation around immigration and housing affordability, though. So if we look here at more people need to come and live here to help build the homes we need during the housing crisis. 41% of Gen Z believe we need more people coming in. That does decline across some of the generations and then uptick again. But then simultaneously, this perception that we need to cut immigration until we get better housing stock. So we've got this polarization and almost this opposition of ideas and a bit of chicken and egg and cause and effect. We need people in terms of trade shortages to help build more houses, but we can't let more people in until we have more houses. So this probably speaks to the challenge for government in this policy area and also the communication around this issue, because we can see one causing the problem, but also being needed to solve the problem. So a really challenging place we find ourselves. Looking to the future, so Perth in 2050. So among Perth residents, about a third of us feel that we're aware of what Perth is going to look like in 2050. So a third of us are aware of the projections of 3.5 million in 2050. And just 19% of us, though, feel that we're prepared to actually accommodate that increase in population. And again, we see more optimism amongst the younger generations and particular pessimism amongst baby boomers for how prepared we are for this population growth here in Perth. The sense to which we feel population growth actually makes Perth a better place to live, probably linked to that narrative around density. What are the benefits of density? Similar here, we're really polarised in seeing the benefits or the negatives around population growth here in Perth. So just 39% of us feel that it will actually make Perth better if we have that increase in population. And again, it declines with age. So younger generations are more likely to see the benefits of higher density population. And we asked the question, what do you think Perth will look like in 2050? Looking to get some a sense of, the feel, the look, what will be different, what do you expect in 2050? A bit over a quarter of us wrote something. They could write anything here. Large urban metropolis is what we're thinking for 2050. Growing stable economy and a larger and more diverse population. The converse to that, populated, too much immigration. For some of us, we feel we're going to be behind and outdated in 2050, and overall a worse city to live in. So a mix of perceptions really in line with how we feel about the increase in population overall. So the final piece we'll leave you with, you'll remember we went through earlier all these detailed areas and the extent to which we feel as Perth residents, these pieces reflect life in Perth today. So we can see here mining resources focused economy, strong economy, technologically advanced, etc. This is how we see life today in Perth. We also asked towards the end of the survey, how important are each of these areas to the future of Perth? And when we plot the two together, we start to see where there are the biggest gaps. So that is the extent to which we feel this is how life is today, this is seen in life in Perth today, compared to the extent to which it's important for the future. And the gap really shows us the focus areas and the priorities for the future. And similarly across lifestyle and some of the social areas. So what are those areas where we have the greatest gap? There's 7 that emerge, and each year we like to look at this as a bit of a roadmap for where we are, where we're going and how we can get there, where the greatest focus might be, an opportunity for the Committee for Perth to help get us there and certainly work with members and business across Perth. So an affordable place to live. We know there is a cost of living challenge at the moment and it is driving our feelings for the future. So increasing affordability. Similarly, increasing safety. So we saw those who felt Perth had declined over 10 years and a strong concern about public safety. Willing to evolve and change. having equal access to opportunities. Remembering we saw Gen Z feeling there were some more likely to feel there were challenges around our society around discrimination and equal opportunity. Access to effective public transport. Still, there is a critical need. We have seen improvement, but still sitting there, and arguably a lot happening in an infrastructure investment space here. Strong economy, and making it into the top 7 is having the right mix of density as well. So maybe the roadmap for moving forward and potential focus areas and opportunity. That was a quick run through. We did okay on time to still have some time for some good discussion, but that was everything to run through and open it up now.
Sally, that was really good. Thank you so much. I suppose I really think it's quite exciting to see that optimism from the Gen Zs. And as somebody who's lived in Perth for 21 years, you know, seeing that ambition in terms of density, particularly that Gen Z 57%. And what was also interesting is seeing it from a point of view of diversity, inclusion, sustainability, all really, really good things from a livability perspective of our city. We have some questions, and again, if you want to ask a question, please put it in the Q&A. One, Darren Batty, sorry, Darren, if I pronounced your surname incorrectly, asked, in terms of comparisons of the Ipsos Perth perception surveys compared to other cities, are we seeing a kind of a general kind of, are we lining up with other cities, or have you seen any kind of really divergent themes from Perth that makes us kind of special?
Great question. And I think a lot of the other committees forward do their similar versions of these studies, and certainly our colleagues in other states do them as well. There are things that are peculiar to us, aren't there? You know, the lifestyle piece is unique to us, and that is a strength that we have, the way that we see that. The Perth Reputation Study was great as well in 2019 that the committee did, because that looked at residents of Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, Singapore and Auckland, and how they perceived their city and how they perceived Perth. So whilst that is 5 years old, there's still some great data in there around where we underperform. And one of those areas was around our propensity to recommend our city from a business perspective. So that was an area of relative underperformance. We've seen some improvements on that, as I said, but still one of our relatively weaker areas. And the other piece would be density. That is something more unique to us here. Potentially places like Adelaide, maybe even Hobart could be similar, but certainly our apprehension around density is something that is more unique to Perth.
Thank you. Steve Cartledge asked about the deregulation of trading hours. That's a hot topic. How can we use this to advocate for change in this area? I would just answer that in the sense that we are sending this to the current government, to the opposition. We have done research on this. Committee for Perth has done research on this topic over the years. The Perth Perception Survey over the years has also, and it's really strong in this edition. But even from speaking to people, what I've heard back is kind of, yeah, that might be the case, but there's not going to be a change in this. So this is an area where, you know, we have had 60 people on this call. We had 130 people register for the webinar. We will be sharing the data with you, and as citizens with voices and votes, this is an area that you can also, you've got the information that you can also socialise within your organisations and within your communities as well. But you can see it is strong, and this is kind of a team sport area would be what I would say. Anything to add, Sally?
Completely agree. And, you know, the data is there. We would say if evidence is useful in the argument, which arguably it always is or should be, there's very clear attitudes amongst the public and growing support for that change to trade hours. So I would say use the information as much as you can to inform the debate. Ideally, it's accurate information informing the debate, and that's what this study from the Committee for Perth can give you.
And again, it's that data, it's not just a one-hit wonder. We've got data going back from 2012 to support some of the cases for these. Liz Bejac, welcome. It's great to have you on the call. Obviously, with your aged care hat on, you've asked, did we go in, did we ask questions for our survey? Sally, thoughts on this? Because of, again, the aging population is important. Did we get any data from there?
It's a great one. And I would say when we came together earlier this year with Paula and the team at Committee for Perth, we had to think about what are some emerging issues that we want to dig into and cover and include as a specific focus area for this year. And unfortunately, this wasn't one of them, Liz. I'm sorry. To your point, though, it could have been a whole focus of the study to really understand what are the barriers and perceptions that we're feeling around availability and access to housing for seniors. But I would say the closest we would have is some of those cuts of baby boomers and the pre-war generation of their perceptions of housing access. So some of that data could be useful. We could also do a scan of the open-ended data, so essentially where people can type anything they like, and just have a look for any themes that might be small overall but focused in this area. But I would certainly say it's a key area of importance and certainly could have been worthy of a whole chapter in the study.
And yes, it's that kind of balance between speaking to everybody, and we were really keen with this survey to test what young people, what the kind of Gen Zs think about things, because we're talking a lot of the time, as I said at the beginning, about Perth 2050. And at our member event 2 weeks ago, we had a year 12 student stand up and say, in 2050, I will be, drum roll, 43. And that really focused the mind on, that 25 years is around the corner, and the impact on young people has been a focus. Mark Nold from Accenture, thank you for your comments. He said, no questions, just great to have consistent numbers to support what many of us have felt around housing and other challenges. Also pleased in the reduction of the, I'm so pleased that we didn't have to use the D word, but the use of boring average perception by half. That's, thank you for highlighting that. And again, it's all up to us to also remind people, if I was driving into work one day and somebody on the ABC spoke about Dullsville, which is a word that's now eradicated from my vocabulary, it's up to us to remind all of us about these positives in Perth. There was a question here. Do you see an increase in affordable housing supply in well-located areas accessible to major employment centres?
I would say, in terms of perceptions in the data, we wouldn't be able to drill down that discreetly. We could probably, we capture people's suburb that they live in, so we capture postcode and suburb level data. Whether we could cut it and look at are there any different perceptions in density or affordability, potentially we could look at that. Would probably be getting down to some small numbers, but it does make sense. If there would be some shifts, they could flow that way, but we haven't got overall insights at that level.
Be quite interesting as the surveys progress with MetroNet's arrival, and obviously infrastructure and transport gets mentioned quite a lot, and whether that changes livability in certain areas that now have access to transport where they didn't have it before. Jason said, would love to see statistics around income inequality. Wouldn't we all? Any thoughts on that in terms of income inequality in the way you've done the survey, or other surveys that you do or see?
Yeah, I think we have, it would arguably be driving some of those differences in perceptions and those who feel life is getting better versus those who feel life is getting worse. So whenever we see periods of a high cost of living stress, certainly income inequality becomes that great divider. I think we kept the demographic. We did go through and remove some demographics again, just in the interest of time. We should still have a measure there around net household or personal income, where we could cut the data. But I would say the great proxy for that, isn't it, is the cost of living crisis that we're seeing, but also really spreading pretty strongly across society as a whole, but of course being felt more acutely by those on lower incomes.
Thank you. Steve Cottage also asked about the 18% wanting to leave permanently. Do we have any reasons why? Because that could be, in terms of marketing and to get them to come back.
Yeah, looking at those, there were some who fall into that younger cohort who do have a perception of leaving for work reasons. That does decline with age, but it is primarily, usually it's either family, which arguably is hard to implement. So that's a very personal reason. But then there is still that driving factor around career reasons for leaving. They're the main reasons that still sit there.
Yes. I'm conscious that we're almost out of time, and a couple of things in wrapping up that made me think about was we almost a year ago had Minister Gorman, Patrick Gorman, and he presented kind of his views on Perth. And it was interesting. His main thing is that Perth should market itself as a family-friendly place. And again, it's interesting to see those stats coming through. And what about where we sit in the region, in that zone of 60% of the world's population? Any thoughts on that as we wrap up?
We saw a nice increase in terms of what we saw as having gotten better in Perth in the last 10 years. More of us seeing Perth as a globally connected big metropolis, which I think is a great indication. And yes, we've still got, I think it was 7% who top of mind said we're isolated. But yeah, this idea that we're bigger, progressive, globally connected. So maybe we are, as we always say, starting to look up instead of east, and really looking at, what is right on our doorstep and the opportunities that does bring. So I would say there is some shifting perceptions around Perth in that way, that we are maybe not, we're more connected and more globally connected than we once were.
Fantastic. Thank you all for joining us. We had 60 people actually sign in. We're down at 41 now. I think that's an incredible credit to you, Sally, for the information. Thank you to Ipsos, Sally, and the team for working with us on this. It's so exciting having this data, and we will, as I said, share it with you. We would ask that if you quote it, please let people know that you've seen it at committee, from Committee for Perth. We'd like to, we would like you to share that. And if you're tagging us on any of the information, please, we'd love that as well. It's great to see this kind of conversation out on socials. Hashtag share your Perth or tag Committee for Perth. So thank you all for giving up your precious time today. And thank you, Sally. And thank you to my fabulous team for making sure that we had no technological glitches. Have a great rest of your day. Please, as I said, it's a team sport. We all need to be advocating for this great place. Thank you. Take care.